30 years ago, in 1991. 30 years ago, I must have been 22 or 23 years old. And perhaps I envy most of you tonight here who are probably in their 20s. I envy the 22, 23-year-old boy I was, because back then I had not only the courage but nothing to lose in terms of the questionings and the issues that I wanted to confront. Evolving Scars is very dear to me as a project, maybe mainly because of that, because I was 23, and I hope that you will see throughout this presentation that many questions that were posed or raised in this project that dates 30 years back still haunt me today in many ways. So, that's for the young kid who was 23 years old that I envy, because, I look at, in fact, in most creative fields, most musicians, painters, and others sometimes produce their most, or throw the most important seeds of their work at the very early stage. So this is for you, young students. This is for you to hopefully remember that now is the time for you to ask the questions that you might not be able to ask once you become a bit too cautious, a bit too lucid, a bit too mature, as our world becomes more and more lucid, mature, and sometimes cynical. Evolving Scars is also very important because it is probably the first project that ties me back to Beirut as an architect. Back in 1991, we were just at the very beginning of the so-called post-war years. For those who are not very familiar with the history of the region, Beirut had gone through 15 years of civil war between 1975 and 1990, during which the so-called historical center of the city had become a no man's land and a battlefield. So back in 1991, there were prospects of reconstruction, big hopes for the reconstruction of the territory, the state, its institutions, but also a systematic erasing of all traces of the war and everything that could bring us back or tie us back to our difficult and sour past. And maybe because of that, maybe because all the traces of these 15 years that were very sour but very important were being completely wiped out, I was drawn to address this issue. As a tutor, I had a fantastic man who's no longer with us, who had also worked a lot on war and architecture. Some of you might know him. It was Lebbeus Woods, who was working on the Balkans. So he was very influential on this issue on me on working on Beirut. So Evolving Scars is more importantly a project that tries to make out of demolition an architectural act, while architecture by definition is about erection of matter. Not only erection in the literal sense of the term, but erection of matter. And here I am at 22, 23 years old with a lot of discontent of what was happening in my academic cocoon and what was happening in architecture generally, with a lot of discontent. I'm thinking if matter is no longer important, maybe the literal disappearance of matter should be an architectural act. There's also this issue of memory and the sour past that we were completely erasing. The Evolving Scars is about the scarring, the disappearance of these buildings that were condemned to be demolished. But while they were being demolished, the idea is that we would create an architectural act, but also we would collect memories of their demolition. So what you see is a ruin being demolished by what I call the memory collector, and this memory collector would be activated by it being fed memory. It would demolish the building and suck its remains, its ashes, into a peripheral membrane. And this would keep on going, and the more demolition, the more ashes in the peripheral membrane, the building would disappear, and this cloud of ashes would form this new facade until the demolition would be complete and the memory collector would dig its own hole and will all disappear under the ground. The anecdote back then was that Beirut, that praised its history by the fact that it has 6 archaeological layers underneath, from Rome to Greece to Egypt and so on and so forth, that the last layer would be immaterial. And it would be the memory that would have been collected. We revisited this project just a few years back and tried to re-simulate it with more contemporary tools of representation. So we represented it by more means that are more in tune with the present, but you can see here a clear correlation between the memory collected that you can quantify in kilobytes or megabytes, the cubic meters of matter that need to be demolished, and the cubic meters of ashes. So the more demolition, the more memory, the more ashes, from beginning to end until the beast digs its own hole and disappears underground. About 10 years later, and it's very important to see some of these ideas that come back. About 10 years later, in 2001, I'm commissioned to work on a ruin, also literally at the edge of the historical center, a building that had been abandoned in 1975, and that had to be reconverted into a restaurant or a bar. Now, between 1991 and 2001, obviously, a lot of things had changed for me. As I came back in 93 to Beirut as a very naive young soldier full of good intentions, thinking that I would be building public housing, hospitals, schools, museums, like any respectable architect. None of this happened. With ideas that try to make demolition, architecture out of demolition, obviously, it was not easy to find clients. The institutions weren't there, the state wasn't being rebuilt. In fact, Beirut was completely in the hands of the private sector. Like most cities, but in Beirut it was extreme. The state was completely absent. So years and years later, I'm recuperated by the entertainment industry. And this is one of the projects I did for the entertainment industry. You know, so much for the big public projects that I was expecting, the museums, the hospitals, the public housing. I never did anything of that. I worked in the vulgar, not so glorious. So this is a bar, a restaurant, a house that has to be converted into a bar, but it doesn't stand anymore. So we can't demolish it because it's supposedly historical. But it's very strange what historical means for preservationists. It means that you have to keep the facade, you have to restore it to its postcard original condition, and they don't care what you do behind the facade. I call these transvestites. So transvestite for transvestite, we will celebrate the transvestite in hopefully a meaningful way. Before you do anything with a structure that's about to fall down, as you need to gut it out to create a new structure, be inside it, as the new function of it is going to be drastically different, you put what you see. You don't see my mouse, but anyway, these temporary beams that hold the facade together, you connect these inside with other temporary beams. It's quite a complex surgical operation. It's in fact very morbid, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is that you're keeping the skin in tension. So it's as if I took your face, I pull the skin up in tension, I dig a hole up in your skull, I retrieve everything out, I replace what was inside by another beast, and then I remove the temporary belts now that there's another beast that can hold the skin up. That's basically what they do. And historians have no problem with this falsification, as long as you keep the facade in its so-called original condition. Its so-called original condition, you know, you have to put some blush and some collagen and some, you know, perform some plastic surgery to keep it very, very supposedly to bring back its glitter of its younger years, and recreate the postcard. So we didn't do that. We wiped out the interior, we put a new monster inside, and this new monster is a vulgar restaurant. And to take the restaurant to an absurd level, we put one single table inside that's huge, with over 40 seats around it. And if you look closely at the center of the table, there's an H-shaped thing, which is with a staircase in the middle. You see it in section. This is where the service is trapped. This is where you keep the waiters. They don't share the space you're seated in. They're standing on a plane that is 40 centimeters lower than the plane you're seated on, so you look down at them. And their only escape is the hole that takes them down to the kitchen, the hole where they belong. This is in a very cathedralesque space that is almost 9-10 meters in height. So it celebrates in an extreme way the decadence of consuming very, very good food and very good wine in this ruin that we have violated. So this is a section, and obviously as we needed a bar, we celebrate the bar above and we turn the bar into a roof. So it's this circle you see, and a chunk of the bar becomes the elevator that brings you down. We build this roof and this bar into a cylinder, which is under 4 meters in diameter and about 20 meters in length. We build it like you build a ship. And I spent every day on site. It was a fantastic experience to collaborate with these artisans that were outside the construction industry. And then when we were done building this new monster, you look clearly that there's new structure that is drawn in black in the inner periphery of the plan. This is the real structure that holds the skin. The skin is dead, in fact, and it's held together behind a wire mesh. We do not remove the temporary beams. We keep the wire mesh, and we keep the rotting walls behind, decomposing, and we play on what I called the poetry of decay. And you can see some of the evolving scars happening here. So my new facade is a very clear intervention that shows very clearly the frames are no longer of the same, the window frames are no longer of the same nature. The violation is very clearly expressed, and we try to hopefully celebrate it in a meaningful way. That's the bar inside. The bar has a circular section so that the roof can rotate around the circular beams and flip and fall underneath into the restaurant. So this is the bar with the roof closed, and this is the bar with the roof opened. You know these bins you put bread in your kitchen? Well, it works like that. And it works very well. So I did a lot of work for the entertainment industry. In fact, no one took me seriously in my early years. I was given my first 6 built projects are temporary buildings. Nobody trusted me to build permanent buildings. There were no institutions to commission me or proposing any serious public buildings. So the private sector was mainly doing real estate projects, and the real estate developers would not trust someone like me to build buildings in which people, families would be raising their kids in, because I just didn't have the reasonable profile of an architect that can be trusted to build serious architecture, or an architecture that is permanent. But as I spent my time in bars at night, trying to forget, the bars recuperated me. So the first building I ever built was a nightclub. But then again, the nightclub was in a very problematic site, just like the Central project I just showed you. So you may think that it's an entertainment project and it's not very serious. In fact, architecture never takes these projects very seriously. You know, you only look at museums, hospitals, public housing, public projects in general, because this is where architecture with a big A is traditionally expressed or happens. The private sector produces garbage usually, and the garbage of the garbage is the entertainment. We don't even dedicate buildings to them. They're stuck in basements of buildings. Nightclubs and restaurants don't deserve architecture. But I'm given that to start with, and nothing but that, the vulgar. But then even where you would think there is no political relevance in such a situation, in fact, if you dig a little bit beyond the surface, everywhere I step a foot in Beirut, it was an explosive site. This site in particular used to be the site of a refugee camp that was burned down to the ground in 1976. We've tried to research the exact events around the Quarantina massacre. There are different versions. So, I'm not going to take you there, but it's very complicated. It's very difficult to design a club on such a site, on a site that where the scars remain very visible. If you look at this picture, in the foreground, it's totally empty. Then you've got this highway, and then in the background, you've got an extreme density. This is very strange because the foreground and what's behind the foreground is the littoral, it's the sea. It's where usually the territory gets developed and then goes inland. But if you look at the map of Beirut or any aerial photograph, you will see that there is a big hole in the quarantine. It's as if the city bypassed it as it sprawled northbound. It's as if this area is doomed. And this emptiness is in fact the very visible scar of the events that have happened in 76, in fact, prior to 76 and then beyond. So the quarantine never really recovered. It used to be the quarantine of the port of Beirut, then it became a refugee camp for Armenians in the 1920s, and then the Armenians moved out, and it's what you see in the background to another area called Burj Hamoud and Mar Mikhail, their quarters that are predominantly Armenian. And then the quarantine was occupied mainly by Palestinian refugees and then Lebanese refugees from the south and various refugees from Syria and low-wage workers. And then in 1976, as it falls under the control of the Christian militias, it gets wiped out and then burned down. And I'm asked some 20-something years later to build a club over this site while Beirut is rebuilding itself in complete denial of its recent past. And what we've decided to do is to take on this challenge, and instead of installing something a rhetorical monument, we've decided to work on this emptiness. So when you drive by, or the void, so when you drive by during the day, and this stretch of highway is probably the most important vehicular access in and out of Beirut, which makes it probably one of the densest vehicular accesses in the eastern part of the Mediterranean coast. So you've got hundreds of thousands of people that drive by. Architecture is very loud around this highway as it's extremely visible, and visibility has financial value. I do exactly the opposite. You drive by this club during the day and you don't see it. It's buried in the ground. It peaks at 70 centimeters above the ground, and it goes to sleep during the day, so it's completely invisible. And it wakes up at night. It wakes up at night as its roof opens. It opens to basically feed by reflection in sound and lights what's happening inside. Remember, there's no one in the quarantine to this date, except my office, which has moved not far away from where the club is located. A lot of army barracks, the garbage treatment company, the tanneries, and the slaughterhouses. So the quarantine stinks. Nobody wants to be in the quarantine. It's a doomed area, and maybe that's why I'm attracted to it. So, so this whole kind of comes to life at night. So this is it during the day. It contracts completely and closes itself and becomes silent, and then at night it wakes up. It wakes up, and the flip-up panel, the flip-up panel has reflective panels in it, so it reflects the warm light but also the sound as there's no one around. And the parking becomes also part of the club, as you can come and drive around. I call it the carousel, and then the cars are parked very respectfully, concentrically around it. So the club and its music and its lights kind of irrigate the whole parking. If you look closer at this building, you'll see that everything about it is wrong. I was very fortunate to have never worked with any architect prior to constructing this thing, but I'm someone who builds and does things. I was a very manual person and very passionate about mechanics and the military and so on. So I drew this thing in my office at night and built it during the day with no contractor and no one from the construction industry. In fact, the first contractor who looked at it told me, go back to school. This is wrong. Everything about it is wrong. And it turns out that he was completely wrong and I was absolutely right. Because this building that had a life expectancy of 5 years and was supposed to be demolished afterwards is today 23 years old or so and is still functioning. And it never leaked a drop of water. Thanks to the artisans who helped me build it, all of them outside the construction industry. So if I have one lesson to give you, you students, fight the construction industry. They're bastards, they don't know shit. Fight them. And build alliances with people outside the construction industry or fantastic trades. You can do wonders. So it was a good thing I had never worked for an architect, and it's a good thing I didn't know what I was doing. As you walk inside, we're 3 and something meters below the ground. In fact, this land became a landfill after 1976. I was told as I researched its history, the camps were in fact 3.5 to 4 meters below. And it became a dump. So every time someone was digging a hole to build something, they would throw the truck's content and fill it with soil. This theory became confirmed as I was digging, and I hit hard soil about 3.5, 4 meters under the actual level above. And this is where the level of the club is, and this is how I opened the floor to the sky. And the whole scenography of the interior is not based, the photos you see on the tables were not the victims of the quarantine massacre. They're in fact our heroes that had passed away. So they are Kulthum, Serge Gainsbourg, Georges Brassens, Miles Davis, but our big heroes because this was a temple of music and pleasure. BO18 was a club that was supposed to be demolished 5 years later as it was built just like the 5 other projects that I built in the first years of my career. They were all temporary buildings. They were supposed to be bulldozed anytime between 5 to 9 years, depending on the project, after the day they were built, or after the time we had signed the rental contract of the plots we built them on. It's very strange for an architect because we are trained to think in permanence. Architecture is the most permanent act. You build something with the fear of it staying and remaining when you would be 6 feet under. It's probably the last profession that is really about that, and the only profession that is about that, which to me is a problem, because it puts architect in a situation that is very problematic, probably much more today than it was the case for my father's and our grandfather's generation, where cities evolve at a much slower pace. You could evaluate the situation, build something, and permanence kind of forgave you because the cities or its condition and its densification happened at a much, much slower pace. Nowadays it's much different, particularly in Beirut, a city that grew in no time, in just a few decades, became extremely dense. A city that was not only, its change was not only about its density, but all the events that were political, social, economical, things that escape you. It's very difficult to see beyond a couple of years or 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of you. So how can you as an architect build something knowing that it will remain and it might become completely unmeaningful when you're 6 feet under? it castrates you. It's a very serious problem. So I didn't have this problem. I was very fortunate because the first 6 buildings that I built were buildings that were going to be demolished while I'm still around, and in fact, demolished in a very close future. It's like a woman who's pregnant. So you're pregnant and they tell you, you're gonna have a baby, but your baby is gonna die 5 years from now, and you'll see him die. It's a very odd feeling. So that's how I started my career, with temporary projects. So this is it at opening. This is more recent. So you can see the kind of spaces I generate. You know, this is 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. People are leaving completely trashed. That lady has her hand in her crotch. You got another guy who passed away on the roof. Another guy kidnapping a girl, and the bouncers are very tired to react. So that's what I was associated to. Not museums, and not public housing, and nothing too serious. But I took it very seriously because I drew this building down to the last bolt. I didn't have an office or employees or anything at the time. So I drew at night and I built during the day. It was the most intense 6 months of my life, and probably the most intense relationship I've ever had with any architectural mission. It was the first one, the first love. And so I drew every single bolt of it, and I built it during the day. And that's my carousel. I built it with very primitive modeling tools. At the time, it was AutoCAD release 12, and I was moving to release 13. So every time you meshed an object and you subtracted something from it, you had to remesh it with very, very primitive computers. So sometimes I would throw a calculation and wait 2-3 hours until the computer responded, or would crash along the way. But I drew its computer model down to the last bolt. And we built exactly as is. This is a more recent photo of it. And as this building was not supposed to last more than 5 years, I built it with very thick steel, 4 to 6 millimeter thick panels, and I did not treat the steel. We didn't have a lot of money to build it. We didn't have a lot of money to paint it. So I let it rust, thinking that no matter how much it's going to rust, in 5 years, it would never eat up the 4 or 6 millimeters. Some 22, 23 years later, the same thick steel is completely rusted, but it did not eat it up. It's still there, you can walk on it, and now it's, in fact, it has stained the concrete circular pad in which it sits, and it looks better rusted than it did when it was all shiny. So I have something with holes. The first building I ever built was a hole for a nightclub, but I proposed another hole that was a bit more serious. This is a collaboration with an artist, a friend, Walid Rad, for a competition a few years back for a modern art museum in Beirut, and to which I was invited. That I did not want to do, but under the influence of my intellectual friends who told me that it was very important that I take a position, that I had to put an answer on the table. But I am not a cynical person, so my answer was very, very serious, except the jury didn't take it seriously. The jury was composed of very, very heavy weights. Lord Palumbo, Rem Koolhaas, you know, to name a few. Richard Rogers, and so on. And this is where you truly understand that these people are dinosaurs, or in fact, they don't know shit when it comes to questions that have to do with the territory, that go beyond architecture in the very, very narrow scope of architecture as they see it, but architecture as a political act. And my answer for this project was that we were not ready for an institutional museum. In fact, we did not, the so-called institution that was behind the project did not have the legitimacy, no one does, to erect a building at this point in time, to in fact buy a collection or put together a collection, acquisitions of art. Who was who during this critical period of modernity on our territory that none of us agree upon, and that is fundamentally political. So our answer was, we dig a hole, we call it stage 0. The foundations of the future museum that will be built when we will be politically ready to build it, when we will be ready to agree on a consensual history. That's how you guys erect museums, and that's how you guys agree on a consensual history. We're not there yet. Remember, we did not rebuild the state or its institutions. So the idea of importing the notion of a museum into our territory is dangerously naive. That was my answer to the grandmasters, the Kulasses, and other dinosaurs. But they didn't get it. They thought they thought it was a joke. But I was extremely serious. And my idea was that with the help of Walid, who's probably the most knowledgeable when it comes to modern and contemporary art in the region, because he's done a lot of works on that, is that in fact, there are lots of incredible private collections, even within the territory of Beirut. And an interesting thing about these collections is that every collector who has purchased art, each one of these private collectors has done it very haphazardly, has done it without the accountability that an institution might have when it's composing, when it's doing acquisitions. Museums have to make consensual choices. These guys didn't. They made choices that were not always very reasonable. The collection of these collections that could be borrowed could be very much in tune with our political environment, our cultural environment, and this completely chaotic environment we're in, this non-consensual environment. So we propose to dig holes within the retaining walls and make permanent galleries where these borrowed acquisitions would come in. And we could imagine circuits around scaffoldings and elevators, construction elevators and so on, cranes, temporary installations that would bring people into the hole, visitors into the hole, an extremely deep hole, into the guts of the territory and into these collections that don't make sense in the consensual sense of the term. This would have been a museum that would be very circumstantial, very much in tune with the political realities, the cultural realities, and the social realities and the economic realities of the environment. This was proposed, I think, back in 2016 or 17. We were disqualified. The idiots didn't get it because the foundations and the retaining walls, not even the foundations, the retaining walls and the excavation and the temporary installations we were looking at were probably under 10% of the cost of construction of their stupid museum that won the competition that never got built because they couldn't get the money. And on top of that, we were proposing to save on acquisitions. Our museum would have existed less than a year after we proposed it, and it would have been a museum that would have caused or stirred a lot of, sent shockwaves, I think, around the art world, because it would have been a very circumstantial museum and not just a stupid replica of Western museum in the Arab world. Yet you've seen a lot in the Gulf states lately. So I'm very much tied to Beirut. Italy knows that. So I was commissioned a piece for the opening of the Maxi Museum in 2010. And I produced this piece for the Maxi. It's called Derailing Beirut. And Derailing Beirut is a circuit where I try to connect various points of interest that were fetishized in the so-called post-war years, during which I started my career. And so we start by drawing this map and these connections, and then as we're architects, we try to ask ourselves, and how do these connections become materialize and become physical connections. And we think of Beirut as a huge theme park, which it was turning into in so many ways. And we try to apply this layer over the city by putting these tracks, and we imagine that these tracks could serve the purpose of connecting these points. And to connect these points on these tracks, we've imagined a capsule. And the capsule would be this fantastic capsule whereby the tourist, the very curious tourist, would lay down, his head placed where the detonator of the bomb would be, for an extreme pleasurable experience of penetrating the city at high speeds, such as going in and out of the Holiday Inn hotel in a split second. And we were very serious about that. So we built the damn thing, and we carried it into our office. We looked at it and we thought we'd roll it around the city, which we did pretty much everywhere, until my team was arrested by the secret services of the army, and we were accused of planting evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which could serve as a pretext for Israel to bomb the city of Beirut. So I had to make phone calls at very high level to liberate 4 of my guys who were in jail because of that. Serious. So Derailing Beirut goes across various points where we have done interventions also. This is within the riverbanks of the river of Beirut, which has become a stream of black, dirty stuff and garbage. And then in and around some of the buildings I've conceived, this is one of them, the river of Beirut, which in 2012 spit blood or a red liquid into the Mediterranean. And we were suspected of being behind that, but we were not. But we confirmed it through drawings. My office is right by the riverbanks of the river of Beirut. Also for Italy, for the Sandretto Foundation in 2008, Francesco Bonami had commissioned me this, which again I did very seriously. I didn't think of it as a museum or gallery piece, but literally as a functional drone, and there was a whole story behind it. It does look like the F-117 stealth bomber, but it doesn't fly, it crawls. And it's used to exchange prisoners of war across enemy lines. And the 2 eyes you see are not the eyes of the prisoner, they're the eyes of those who have released him and are making use of him to scan the territory as he's crossing the demarcation lines, and his liberation is a sort of, implies a certain creature because he is sending information to the enemy. But it was all built on a lexicon of military terms, an American lexicon of military terms that we had tried to translate architecturally. We also built this thing, and it is functional. We've made videos of it as it operates. But from smaller things to larger constructions, this is probably the largest footprint I have ever built within the territory of Beirut, completed in 2017. But this is also a very difficult project, where again, I was telling you earlier, every time you step a foot on a site, it is explosive. This one was particularly explosive. A client comes to me with a big piece of land on which we can build over 25,000 square meters above ground of sellable area at an extremely low price, the piece of land. And everything around it is agricultural, so fantastic. But the developer looks at numbers, and before making the purchase, he asks for a reality check from an architect who has to make sure that we can get all the built-up area on that site. It takes me less than 24 hours to call my client and tell him, run away from it. It is toxic. It is extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous, not because there are bombs or mines or any toxic chemicals in it, because the fabric on which it stands, in which it is extremely toxic. Surprisingly, I would have never thought it could be so toxic. And you could witness the complete bankruptcy of the institutions and the state, in fact, on that piece of land and its situation, and how the fabric had evolved around it. As most of the plots around it are at this point agricultural, they are by zoning, they can be built with a very high exploitation factor. But the periphery of the plot, the perimeter of it, is 404 meters, linear meters, out of which only 6.5 meters intersects with public space. Now, for those of you who don't understand, I will translate. This means that only 6.5 meters can have setback and open views and open air guaranteed, which means that over 98% of the periphery can be subject to blind walls of the neighboring plots once they get built, because they would turn their back to us and get their oxygen and their lights from the public grounds that are around. This means that this could be an enclave, a huge enclave with 400 meters of perimeter, out of which only 6.5 meters can be an open window. The rest of it could be blind walls all around. But then developers have a different logic. He comes back to me and tells me, no, I'm getting it. I have a solution. His solution was to retract, because the plot is 150 something meters deep, to retract to the bottom of the plot and build a very high tower, the highest tower in Beirut, 300, 400 meters high, get the exploitation on very small footprints, turn his back, give blind walls to the neighboring plots at the edge, and get the setback within his own plot. The story of our lives, mechanisms of survival that are sometimes dangerously spontaneous. But this is the story of our fabric. So buildings are built in defensive postures in Lebanon. And I tell him, I can't do this. I cannot erect a blind wall hundreds of meters in height, as I'm the first one to erect a building here. It is a crime. And he tells me, I'll do it with you or without you. Story of my life. So we decide to take it on. And what we've done is probably, if there is one building that we can qualify as masochistic or maybe suicidal, that would be this one. We retract 4.5 meters at ground level, which is the minimum setback to get air and light if you're building one floor in height. And then we keep on retracting, offsetting as we move upwards to guarantee air and light, even if there is a blind wall that gets erected in front of us. And it draws the building, it draws the plan, over 100 apartments, every single plan different one from the other, extremely complex structure, extremely interesting spaces that would have not happened in a normal situation. And what you end up with is something that looks like a monster, but is in fact an extremely gentle monster that is completely naked, opens his arms and kind of retracts backwards, awaiting for the next door neighbor to come. And hopefully, because you've done a nice gesture, and because 100% of the periphery is transparent and welcoming, he will not turn his back to you. And we've taken this logic all the way. I mean, literally, I did not draw a thing. I let it go up to 50 meters, which is the allowable height before going to a higher council of urbanism, and put in the maximum volume I can put and the total BUA I'm allowed to build within 50 meters. And it drew itself up by setbacks that the zoning draws. And what it gives you is fantastic terraces around the apartments. And we take it literally very far, so that the handrail is not a handrail, it is a bar. At this point, you can put your plate on it and your drinks and have parties looking at the agricultural land around you. But hopefully, 5, 10, 15 years from now, if the moron in front of you does not turn his back as his building is building, you would be having a conversation with the next door neighbor, or maybe fall in love with your neighbor. So it is a completely porous sponge all around, and it creates very interesting relationships even between the neighbors, almost carnal, and types of apartments that I would have never conceived of if I was in a regular situation. They're balcony apartments. I was just at a party in one of them just a week ago, and they're really party spaces. They're not dwellings in a box. So you could go into your apartment from your balcony and go from any room to any other room through the balcony. They're floating houses in the sky. So you see, sometimes the catastrophic conditions can lead you, if you think a little bit outside the box, to situations that are far more interesting than the conditions, that the more stable, reasonable conditions in the more stable and reasonable environments. Sometimes the catastrophes can produce good things. And I think this building is good. It looks mean, but it's not. It's a very nice building. So, we've built, you know, from the entertainment sector that has gotten us some sort of credibility, as it came with a lot of media attention. We started being taken more seriously by the developers. So this is the first tower I built in Beirut. It's this thing you see to the right that stands like a sentinel, and if you look very well, it's right there, almost guarding the port. So it is a building that is very much in relationship with the port. It has its two cannons pointing towards the port in a very defensive posture, looking at the port as a new line of demarcation. And it is not a good-looking building. It has been distorted by various changes in plan by the developer as it was moving up. It was a Swiss watch to begin with, but then it turned out to be a mess by the time we were done. But I liked it, even though it was a mess. And has sometimes very decadent posters on its roofs. And however, it was very much in relationship to the port. I started its descriptive text back in 2010, saying that Beirut is a port city. Now you'll see what happened to it in a few minutes. Just a few hundred meters away from that comes another commission, just a couple of years later, that we just completed in 2019. This one, unlike the banana-shaped boat building, which is completely open, this one is completely closed, and it was built right around the same time. This one is a fortress. And I was saying earlier, we're having a coffee before the conference, I'm the kind of architect who can completely contradict himself from one street corner to the other, although they're both pretty much the same program. They're both apartments for the rich. That's not a good thing to say. They're not public housing. They're in Beirut, the same city. They're commissioned at the same time. But I didn't do what a star architect would do while addressing Beirut. Oh, it has to be beige, or it has to be a musharrabi, you know. It doesn't matter if it's transvestite. It has to look like. No, we're not like that. My buildings are very often black, because I think Beirut can be very black and very gray. And these two buildings say things that are radically different one from the other. One is completely open, one is very carnal with its surroundings. The other one, this one, is very defensive. It is a fortress, and it is a fortress with a collection of apparatuses around it that are mechanisms of control, electronics, the phobia of security, because it stands on the demarcation line facing the headquarters of the Falangist party, literally at the edge of the former city center, and where the events of the Black Saturday happened in February 76 also. So it is on a very, very sensitive site. Although the spaces are very luminous and open on all orientations, but they're hidden behind this second skin, this defensive second skin. This is above the mirror, a projected mirror, and right around where the beginnings of the protests of October 19 were beginning. We were photographing it. We were just finishing the building. For the Seoul Biennale this year, I did a small recap of this glorious period of 15, 20 years during which I built a lot in Beirut. And we pulled out of the archives 48 missions within the perimeter of Beirut during that period. 48 missions, and the city is quite small. None of them, not a single one of them public, all of them private. 48 commissions, and we've tied all of these to their respective sites. And we've evaluated the total built-up area to be around 450,000 square meters, I would guess, and over $600 million of construction budgets, of construction costs in a very, very short period of time, in a very small city, all of it private. This was completely crazy. This is very much, reflects very much the financial Ponzi scheme we were living and in which I was operating. But everything has changed. And you're probably aware of what's been happening financially economically over the last 2 years in Lebanon. Well, the bubble kind of exploded, and we're going through probably the worst national bankruptcy in the history of nation states ever. And beyond this, just a few months later was August 4th, 2020, in the port of Beirut, the biggest blast ever after Hiroshima and Nagasaki in an urban environment. I was about 900 meters away from the epicenter is where my office is located. It was completely wiped out. But you recognize two of my buildings here in the foreground that were literally at the forefront. The guardian of the port I was describing earlier was smack in the middle of it. Lots of casualties, and we lost some lives. But my baby, which was relatively young, that I thought would survive me, was completely dead. I mean, at least had lost its skin. It was extremely violent. The building next to it is also from that same period I had just completed. So I decided right after the explosion to, while each one of us was doing something, people were donating money, doctors were donating their know-how. I think every single good citizen was trying to do something. So my donation was to come to rescue this building, which was severely damaged, and I offered my services to rehabilitate it, or at least propose a rehabilitation scheme that would be more affordable. First of all, because you have to be very pragmatic, would cost less than rebuilding it as it was to begin with, but also, and more importantly, to take on what the state would not do, to try to at least illustrate what has happened in a positive way or in a constructive way, because the state wouldn't do it. As we know it, at some point, the silos, which were right next to the hangar that blew up, will be wiped out, and maybe they will build some stupid little memorial, but because the causes of the explosion to this date, and I don't know if any of you are following up on the investigation, but the political parties and the ruling political class is trying to stop these investigations because the reasons behind the explosion are political, and I don't know if we'll ever know what has brought, why and how this has happened. So if justice is not going to happen, obviously the state will never be there to recount anything seriously on the territory. So these are images that forensic architecture has provided us with, and they've tried to study the impact of the blast, determine its radius of combustion, which was 1.6 kilometers, so it's a circle of 3.2 kilometers in diameter. You were inside the bomb. It was still in combustion. If you were 1.6 kilometers away from the center, you were still within the combustion. And beyond that, it was just blowing. And the three buildings they took was the hangar, in which the ammonium nitrate was stored. The second was the silos, which are right next to it. And the third was my guardian angel, which was very, very badly hit. And what we've done is that we've tried to very scientifically, almost like a medical operation, we've scanned, well, we don't have scans that are that big, but we have, through photographic surveys and our initial execution drawings, we were able to mark the state of every single panel, of aluminum composite panel, from 1 to 5, and we've categorized from 1 gone to 5 intact. So the various states of impact on each one of these panels, and depending on their geometry and their placement to each other, we developed a software that stitched basically by means of multiplying the vertexes, the more impact on each panel, and according to its geometry, the more vertexes, and then the connection of these vertexes are drawn by a software that would have never been able, I would have never been able to do this manually. It basically drew the stitches. There are still theoretical stitches of the skin. I'll spare you the details. It was a very complex process, and at that point we still didn't know how these would materialize. And then I realized that at the end I would no longer put back the aluminum composite panels, but I would replace them with literally materializing these stitches by steel bars or aluminum bars. So imagine that this is a chunk of the facade that we are to rehabilitate. We would stitch it that way. These stitches are not drawn by me, they're drawn by the software, because they get more and more complex depending on which angle of the building you look at. And then we turned this into something more serious architecturally. It turns out to be that. In fact, cost less than the stupid panel boards that you would import from China, and we can get artisans, local artisans, to work on them. They're very, very basic. We call it in French du barodage instead of bardage. I don't know how to translate this. So it's not paneling, but it's whatever. So this is now under construction. We're stitching it back, and it will probably be the only trace after we're done of the crime, as everything will be cleaned up and brought back to its original state as if nothing had happened. No, on a lighter note, I also work outside of Lebanon. We've had commissions in 17 different countries. My latest story now is in Senegal, in Dakar. We're working on the Corniche, but also the possibility of an airport. But we've worked in Armenia. This is in Gyumri, also a complicated terrain. But this was one of the first opera theaters that was abandoned, and now is occupied by a school of a center for creative technologies for kids between the age of 12 and 18. So we just completed this, and we've worked inside and outside the building and above the building. So it's really a very energetic move into a town that is now abandoned, where only old people live. It was hit in 1988 by a major earthquake, and it was abandoned by the Soviets to become a city in a very very unattractive for the youth. So we're trying to re-inject some life to it. TUMO is a school for creative technologies, which I've been working with since they've started in 2006, 2007, and I became their architect on various interventions. So you see, I can be very colorful too. It's not always black. This is our intervention in Paris. They are workstations that go and fly up when class is over and come back down. The kids love them. They're manufactured in Lebanon because the French couldn't build them, and then shipped and installed in Paris. Voilà, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It was very interesting, even if I know a lot of your work through your website, through the issues, the infinite issues where your work is published. Unfortunately, I never come to Beirut to visit your architecture. But I think that especially your last images, no, the images of the port, of the bomb, and of the devastation of this attack, show us also another way to rethink to this idea of restore, no, how to restore. You show us many ways to think on the existing building which are ruined and how to work with this. But in this moment, before giving the floor to some others of the person who are present today, I would ask you something more about this idea. I would like you to explain something about this idea of being an architect of the present, no? Which is something that you also try to explain with this concept of temporary and permanent. Because, for example, in Europe, no, we have very famous architect, even in the past, I don't know, John Soane. John Soane used to draw his project in ruins to see if they can be sustainable in the future. No, he used to draw it as ruins. Or I don't know, the Albert Speer, in the same case, is an architect who had a lot to deal with a sort of idea of monumentality, and also he was also an architect very much involved in the war, in the Second World War, and used to draw or to imagine, or he also made a sort of theory of ruins starting from his architecture, from his plans. Today you show us another idea, and your idea was very, and I think that you give us a sort of another point of view, no? How to think our task of architect, not in terms of permanence, but in terms of temporary. It means to deal with the time of architecture, of the buildings, in a very different way. And I don't think that in this school we deal a lot with this idea. So if you can clarify something more.
I don't have a specific answer. I don't have a definite answer. But I'm haunted by these questions of temporality. And again, it's not by coincidence that I started my project, my presentation with Evolving Scars, which is about the disappearance of a building at a very specific moment in time. And I said, this is going to haunt me throughout 30 years, or literally 30 years after. And these questions are still there. And You talked about architects envisioning their buildings as ruins because, well, up until a certain moment in time, erosion maybe, or the factor of erosion was what could eat up a building. We didn't see beyond this, but today we witness, depending on which city, you live in which kind of fabric you experience, but to different degrees. What impacts the built environment are issues and parameters that are not just about the elements, and but there are other forces at play here. They're economical, they are political, they are social, they are whatever, and they move at incredible speeds to a point that we drag behind. It is a problem. We're given projects as architects. We try to understand the context, and we have very primitive tools to understand a context, particularly what is taught to us in schools. The understanding of context is archaic for architects. And then you've got the wise and cynical who comes, 10, 15, 20 years ago and goes to the GSD, Harvard, and hijacks 15 students to produce thick books about the Gulf cities, for instance. You know who I'm talking about. And they try to understand context through data. And they make big, thick publications. You know who I'm talking about. Okay? But those also are extremely superficial means and tools to understand context. And as much as we think we can understand it, it escapes us. So we're given a commission, and I've lived projects that from the time we started negotiating and producing a concept to the day we've delivered the buildings, 7, 8, 9 years pass. By the time you're done, your understanding of the present and the condition and the context 7, 8, 6, 5, 3, 4 years ago no longer stands. The conditions are different. So we have a serious problem with temporality, a very serious problem that no one brings about. No one talks about it in architecture theory. It's as if our theoreticians are the guardians of some sort of archaic, sacred, archaic practice that is self-centered and in complete denial of all the forces that make the architectural act possible. We don't understand, we don't question what precedes the act, and we certainly don't understand what follows the act. We're stuck in the middle, in an absurd parenthesis called architecture, with very, very primitive, rudimentary tools. We're completely off. It was not the case of our grandfathers. It started to become the case of our fathers. But you cannot think like that anymore, because you're going to be on the margins of society and where meaning is produced. Just think of what an architect was worth 100 years ago and what he's worth today. I graduated from Harvard, and I wasn't worth $30,000 a year. When I had friends who didn't have 3 years of study in finance, were polishing their nails and making $500,000 and driving Ferraris in New York. There's a problem here. I cannot design a hotel without a hotel consultant. I cannot design an airport without an airport consultant. I can't design a mall without a mall consultant. So at the end of the day, the DNA of your commission, of what you're supposed to manipulate, you don't even handle, you can't do. They dictate to you. You know what the mall consultant is? He's a 30-year-old moron who hasn't built a thing, who comes to you with a thick pile of papers and tells you what you can do and you can't do, and what works and what doesn't. And that's architecture. And the guardians of discipline go and do biennales and whatever, and are extremely proud of what they're saying and what they're doing. We are bankrupt if you don't wake up. Temporality.
Thing about when you show us the museum, you explain a concept. You said, I, as an architect, I want to pose a question on the table, an answer on the table.
Yeah.
Is usually architects are conceived as problem-solving people, no? Instead, you were very provocative.
Well,
and you said, but then, after the port destruction, instead you show your ambition to be also an architect as a problem-solving people.
but I like to think that, or I would love to see architects being involved with what precedes the act again, in what builds up the program of a project, in terms of what can build a situation beyond architecture in its very reductive sense of the word. And I think our most interesting projects were, at least to me, were conditions were conditions that allowed us to negotiate with the decision makers things that were fundamental before we discussed architecture. They were about and this is why I don't do competitions. I'm the champion of losing competitions, because you know what a competition is? A competition is submitting to a program with absolutely no questioning of what that program is. You can't negotiate it. I often compare doing a competition to sitting in a vitrine in a red light district and showing your boobs. That's what it is. You cannot talk. There's nothing that precedes the act. It is the most degrading, pornographic act ever, architectural competitions, because you don't negotiate the program. The minute you negotiate it and you question it, you're out. Finish. It doesn't work. So you have to have sex without discussion. And if you don't fuck well, you lose.
If you have any questions, I don't know if some of the architects who are now present or some of the students, se avete domande potete porle anche in italiano, insomma, a parte che avendo ascoltato tutto il tempo immagino parliate benissimo inglese. Non so se c'è qualcuno. Fatevi coraggio. Io... Prego. Le porto...
Hello. Would you mind sharing the software that you use for the stitches?
You have to talk to my acrobats. I no longer model myself, so my modeling skills stopped in the late 90s with release 13 of AutoCAD. These line drawings you saw of the club. Beyond this, the minute I started an office, it was over. I had the young kids your age going much faster than me. So I sit next to them and they fly the machine. I'm a co-pilot. But you're welcome to get in touch. And
Is there an email?
yes, it's on my website. Just remind us that you want to talk to me or message it to me and I'll have someone get in touch with you or tell you what it's about.
Other question? Anche se le avete in italiano possiamo tradurre. Non fate timidi.
Thank you.
I have a question. I have a question.
Okay, sure.
You say at the beginning of your presentation that you are passionate with the mechanic and military architecture. I think I quite understand why you are passionate with the military architecture, but can you explain where this passion with the mechanic came out? And second question.
Let's take them one at a time. I'm from the generation of what they call petrol heads, you know. Petrol heads. My son, for instance, is not interested in mechanics. You know, when I was 12, 11, in fact, I made a big fuss at home because I wanted a motorcycle. I got my first motorcycle at the age of 11, and I could dismantle the engine a year later and put it back together. I'm probably the last, we are probably those who are in their 50s, early 50s, the last generation of the mechanical age. After that, I see my son, the generation after, they're not concerned with mechanics. They're not impressed by the mechanical machine. They're somewhere else. His only question, the guy over there, is what software I used. You know, they're somewhere else. They're no longer in matter, which I completely understand. Now I'm an old schmuck, you're a young man. So, and the military, because the military is well, they were always a few decades ahead. In fact, internet comes from there, but I mean, you look at airplanes; they're magnificent machines. They're scary, but they're magnificent. The scary can be beautiful too. So my fetish plane was that F-117, but then came the B-2, and then other very, very dangerous and furious machines. But because they are extreme, they take the mechanical performance to an extreme level, which buildings don't do. They're very, you know, again, Kulas has been out in 2014, celebrated what? Mechanical ducts, escalators, and toilets. It's really, there's nothing impressive there. But if you look at other disciplines and you see the glory of the mechanical age, I think us architecture, we were literally dragging behind, and it's probably the least interesting discipline that didn't really bloom at all relative to other disciplines that took the mechanical age to far more interesting extremes. And that's why when I look at architecture and what it has produced during modern times, I'm really not impressed. I look at Koulas's 2014 celebration of the elements, and I think it's an insult to modernity. It's a complete insult to modernity. And beyond that, it's completely apolitical, which I have a serious problem with, because our fathers and grandfathers are probably turning in their tombs, because it's completely void of any political agenda. But beyond that, on the mechanical level, it's zero. So I'd rather look at cars. I love old cars from the 60s and 70s. They were great eras, you know.
Thank you very much. Now, the second question,
Yeah.
the curiosity, is that do you collaborate with the engineer to design your mechanical architecture, or?
I collaborate with yeah, I don't know if you can call them engineers. Some of them have engineering degrees, but I've had fantastic stories with artisans and what we call in our jargon subcontractors. So the steel manufacturers, those who really, I have great respect for them. I have no respect for contractors. Every time we sit down in a meeting and there's a contractor, I humiliate him. Every time they open their mouths, I shoot at them because they are formatted to push papers and are slaves of the construction industry and everything it implicates. But every time an artisan with dirty hands, you know, in cuts and black nails talks to me, I kneel. I kiss his hand. I treat him with respect. But the others, no respect.
Just a final observation. It's an interpretation of your career. It seems to me.
I'm still active.
Yeah,
I didn't
die. Of course, of course. It seems to me that you had a phase where temporary was becoming permanent, and a second phase where permanent were becoming temporary. And this is, I think, linked also to the condition of Beirut, no? And the transformation of the city, I imagine. I'm wondering if you feel that there's a thought of you before and after the explosion in Beirut. Have you changed some position about or not?
Well, it's a very pertinent and also a very difficult question, because the explosion came in a period of re-questioning, because there was an implosion in October 2019, which became very visible with the protests and the fall of the value of the Lebanese currency overnight. We were feeling it coming. I was feeling it coming because of our sector was already beginning to, at which point I am a product of my context, and as much as I want to say that I've built and I was commissioned in various territories, at the end of the day, I think I'll be remembered for the work I did in Beirut, mostly, and I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I'm very much, I've always glorified the local. I think the local can do things that the visitor or the outsider expert cannot do. So when I came to realize after 2016, 17, 18, 19, and then the catastrophes came in 20 and so on, that maybe Beirut was wiped out. And it was the end of a chapter of 30 years, which, as problematic as it was also booming in many other ways, in questions, in finance, in a lot of, and that was over. And it's very tough when it's over and you're at 50. It's okay when you're 25, 30, because you can pick up and leave. It's okay if you're 70 or 75 and you've had it and it's about time to relax. But at 50, you're a very young architect. You're just beginning. It's very tough. So these are questions that don't have an answer. And I think I'm moving in reaction to there was this will at some point to start doing competitions, which was completely against my philosophy for the last 25 years. I was laughing at my colleagues, insulting them when they were doing that, spitting at them and degrading them. And then at some point I thought, well, maybe it's about time I prostitute myself. I sit behind the glass and I take off my clothes and show my boobs, so to speak. But so we did 3, 4 competitions. We lost them one after the other, completely, you know, as usual, because we re-questioned. We tried to play it smart. I don't know. But yes, the project I saw, the stitching, may show some sort of post-permanence stance, where the so-called permanent building was not, in fact, permanent, and that the temporary, which was supposed to be wiped out in 2003, still exists today. So you're never so sure when it comes to temporality, to go back to your early question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
May I? Hi, my name is Andrea Vassilli, and I was going to ask you some more political question. And if I may, I ask you if you are somehow angry toward the Western society that somehow is trying to teach models, both way in a political and architectural way, to the Eastern society. And somehow, most of the time, this model, in my opinion, is not the right model to teach. And so we try, and even the way we try in teaching something, maybe it is so bad. And I'm asking you if you feel angry at this, if you ever had this feeling.
I very early on, in the early years of the supposed post-war or reconstruction of Beirut had taken positions that some have looked at as being a bit too radical or too drastic relative, for instance, to the intervention of the so-called star architects that came from the West, you know. In fact, in the whole city center of Beirut, which was to be rebuilt and was supposed to be the vitrine of post-war Lebanon, as an ideal territory where East meets West, Islam meets Christianity, you know, the whole beautiful story. It was, in fact, there was a private company behind it. It wasn't the state. There was a private company that was entrusted to do it. It's a very complicated story. It turns out the prime minister had started a private company. It's the Hariri story for those who know the scenario. But anyway, there was a list of 20 architects put by the company. Every time you purchased a plot and you were to build something on a key site, there was a list of 20 architects that the company gave you under the table telling you, you have to work with one of these 20. None of the 20, there was not a single Lebanese, not a single Arab, by the way. None. So they were all either big American corporate companies or Zaha Hadid or Jean Nouvel or Herzog et de Meuron or whatever. And you had everything from the classical, the neoclassical to the so-called avant-garde or whatever, but not a single local, none. That wasn't imposed by the West. That was imposed by the stupid Lebanese. Now you go to the Gulf cities, Dubai, for instance, the hype, the supposed hype of Dubai. When you look carefully at Dubai, there's not a single building, not one single building over the last 20, 25 years of noise that they've been produced, not one single building you will look at that would be worth, you know, a piece of paper you wouldn't wipe your ass with. Not one, not a single one. And all of it is the product of Anglo-Saxon big machines. 90% of Dubai is built by American, Canadian, Australian, South African companies, Anglo-Saxon. And then you've got the very few, the top of the top, the cream of the, which is given to star architects when they want a big name, supposedly. And they'll end up doing under products of what they've done in Berlin or Paris or whatever. So it's not a matter of being us against them, the East against the West, as much as it's a problem, I think, of us in our territories having the courage to stand and to give the possibility for local modernity to emerge from within. Dubai will never be an interesting territory because nothing stems from inside. Nothing comes out of these territories. But you go to some areas in the Balkans, you go to Armenia, you start to see things coming from within that would not be possible in Berlin, would not be possible in... And this is exactly what I hope can happen in these territories. A modernity that is very specific to the territory. It's not us against them. It's for us to give them lessons and not take lessons from them.
Thank you so much.
Okay.